Do ordinary Australians have much say about what government does? 70% of us don't think so. Dissatisfaction with the way power is wielded in this country is a common theme in the Australia Talks data. 77% of us don't think that ordinary voters have enough power and influence. But despite feeling rather powerless, we're not giving up on voting and democracy entirely. Just 1 in 4 think there's little point in voting because nothing really changes. The voting group most divided on this question is One Nation voters. 46% of them say there's little point in voting. On the whole, we're still into the concept of democracy. 87% of us agree it's preferable to any other form of government. So, if not voters, who do Australians think does pull the strings in this country? The vast majority of people think these groups have too much power and influence in Australia. Social media companies, and 2/3 say they have far too much power. Media companies are not far off, and similar for big business. 3/4 of us think major political parties have too much influence. The same for lobbyists for special interest groups. We're more divided over whether unions are too powerful in this country. And who doesn't have enough power? Most of us think small business should get more influence.
Aaron Martin is an Associate Professor of Political Science and the Co-Director of the Policy Lab at the University of Melbourne, and he joins me now for more on this topic. Good afternoon and welcome to you.
Kirsten, great to be with you.
70% of us don't believe ordinary Australians have much say about what government does. How can that view be reconciled in a country where voting is compulsory?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's a pretty logical response in terms of most of us don't have much of a say over what the government is doing day to day. So the machinery of government is often ticking along in the background, often quite productively, and we as citizens don't see a lot or have a great influence over that. So I think in some ways the response reflects that lack of input into day-to-day politics.
This might go to what you were just saying, an even greater percentage don't believe ordinary voters have enough power and influence. What are the challenges and the risks when a majority of the population feels disenfranchised?
Yeah, I think the real danger for government are these sort of long-standing trends that this new data speak to, which, as we've seen over the last decade, political trust declined quite precipitously. We've seen satisfaction with democracy decline quite precipitously. We saw an uptick in those metrics over the course of the pandemic, and there's an open question as to how long that will last. But I think overall, there's just a lot of skepticism. Now, skepticism is not necessarily unhealthy, but I think if that develops into a very corrosive form of cynicism, whereby people develop an attitude that the game is rigged, that big business just calls the shots and government is dictated to by them, I think there's a real danger in that, because those sort of people then just tune out of the system, and they're not paying attention to politics and the actual quite meaningful effect politics has on people's day-to-day lives.
Who besides big business do you think Australians feel that actually holds the power?
Yeah, I think there's this general attitude that there are these vested interests which have too much of a say into politics or are too close to politicians. So one of those is big business, but the other, as we saw from the data a moment ago, is actually social media companies, and just I think, warranted concern about the effect those companies have on Australian democracy.
Do you think people who feel powerless or unseen are more or less likely to support fringe candidates and parties?
I think so, because I think if people develop this attitude that, the system is rigged, or, that they're all the same, it's Tweedledee and Tweedledum, which I just don't think is borne out by the evidence. Because if you look at the 2019 election, the major parties went to the election with vastly different policy platforms. So to argue that they're all the same, I think, is actually quite implausible. But there is this group of people who think that, voting doesn't matter, that, they don't trust government. And I think they're really ripe for the picking by minor parties or fringe candidates who come along with seemingly simple solutions to what are just fundamentally complex problems. And they tap into that cynicism that I think the data shows.
Do you believe Australians are feeling any differently on these questions than they might have in past years?
I think there's really two big shifts in that regard. One is the shift in attitudes towards social media companies. So there was a time not that long ago, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, when people would say, isn't Facebook wonderful? Isn't Google wonderful? They improve our lives. And that has just changed dramatically. And I think that is warranted because the effect of social media companies on not only Australian democracy, but the mental health of young people has just been fundamentally damaging. And I happen to believe that there could come a time when social media companies are seen in the same way that we see tobacco companies today, because they're just doing, I think, a lot of irreparable damage. So I think that is a real change over the last decade or so. And then I think on the other side of that, there's been a real softening of attitudes towards unions. So I think people had more they were more opposed to unions. And I think in a new economy where there's lots of precarious work, where there's growing levels of inequality, actually people, even though they may not be union members, see a role for unions and in sort of mitigating some of the negative effects of those trends.